little housekeeping. First of all, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. The structure of this event will first be introductions, then a program with Carmella Scorcia Pacheco. Lastly, it will have time to take questions and comments. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to write in your concern in the chat box, and we can assist you there. And then to ask a question or make a comment, feel free to also write that in the chat. I can read that for you, or that Q&A box, you can write a question. You can also click on raise hand to be unmuted at the appropriate time. Yeah. And for those who just popped in, welcome. Carmella Scorcia Pacheco is a PhD candidate in border studies at the University of Arizona. Her research focuses on utilizing the folkloric record to recover feminine voiced narratives of 19th and early 20th century New Mexico. As a scholar, educator, and cultural worker, she engages with archival studies, community fieldwork, folkloristics, is that right? And expressive culture of the US Southwest Borderlands in the form of literature, music, art, and language. Her work has been featured in the New Mexico Historical Review, the Journal of the Southwest, Borderlore Online Journal, and the Smithsonian Folklife Magazine. Please welcome Carmella Scorcia Pacheco.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everyone at the Santa Fe Public Library. It's an honor to be here and an honor to share this research with all of you. And thank you, especially Jessica, for organizing this event and hosting this event. I'm honored to be here. And so, first of all, I'd like to recognize the indigenous lands that we are all on here in Tucson, Arizona. I am on the indigenous lands of the Tohono O'odham and the Pasquayaqui tribe. And in Santa Fe, New Mexico, I'd like to recognize the indigenous Pueblo lands of Poegepe, and also known as Santa Fe. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here with you all. I can't see you, but I know you're there. So thank you so much for being here. And let's go ahead and get started. Just a second. Okay, so here is the title of my talk, La Votación, the Ballad of the Vote and New Mexico's Suffrage Movement. And here I have pictured some women from 1916 in Las Vegas, New Mexico, campaigning for the right to vote. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about, and especially not just the suffrage movement, but a modality of balladry that's going to illuminate a lot of the process of the suffrage movement. So to go ahead and get started, I'd like to give a little overview of what I'll be talking about. As Jessica mentioned, I'm really interested in recovering narratives, omitted narratives, and alternate histories. So what do I mean by alternate narratives and alternate histories? I mean those that haven't really been taught to us growing up in the Southwest. We've been taught much of the Eastern colonies history, but we haven't really learned, or in my case, we didn't have the opportunity to learn so much of our local culture, language, and history in public learning spaces. And so that's why I'm very dedicated to recovering these rich cultural artifacts and utilizing them as ways to understand and expand our historical repertoire. So the way I do that is a poetic analysis of balladry. And in this case, what I'm looking at is the suffrage movement as the contextual component, but balladry as the form of the way to investigate the suffrage movement. So it's actually a lot of fun because I'm implementing music, lyricism, and this rich oral tradition of women who have passed down this tradition from generation to generation, and that's something that we as Nuevo Mexicanos should be proud of and to celebrate our rich Spanish in the area, right? And to really embrace its variety, right? And see it as something to celebrate. And that's exactly what I am doing with this ballad. So I like to use this in my classrooms as a language and history learning tool, and to celebrate that variety of Spanish. And ultimately, I would like it to be, my hope is that it serves as a model for students, for educators, for community members at large to do something similar, right? So we have so many resources available in our archival institutions and within our community. So the community itself is an amazing archive that we can just, sit down at the table and talk to our pramitas or our family members about their histories and learn from them. So let's go ahead and get started. So this one is about El Corrido de la Votación, so the ballad of the vote. And what exactly is a corrido? So here I have pictured a few album covers of some examples. So the corrido, it comes from the Spanish word correr, which is to run. And it's a form of narration, a highly poetic form of narration with a specific amount of syllables in each line, a specific manner of rhyming every other line, usually the second and the fourth line. And in that way, it was easier to remember. So being that this is an oral tradition that was spread from person to person, community to community, it's a rich form of spreading the news, right? So I like to see it as a form of social media. So when there wasn't the technology that we have today, corridos were and continue to be a form of spreading the news, right? And so it's a specific type of journalism. It's not just reporting headlines or anything like that. It's more of like an editorial. And so a lot of times these corridos have to do with social conflict, social injustices, and it's taking an opinionated stance. So you already have to know the news, and then you can embellish with a corrido and really take a stand on some of these events. And I have some examples here. So corridos are very well known from the Mexican Revolution. They're also very well known in the borderlands of the Southwest. Americo Paredes, a scholar of corridos, mentioned that it's the ballad of border conflict, right? So, or it's the similar to what I think Jose Saldivar mentioned, that it's the socio-poetic paradigm of Chicano literature. And so I have some examples here, and I have our very own, the late Roberto Martinez, who wrote corridos, and a well-known musico from New Mexico who wrote about some of the social injustices that did take place. And if you haven't listened to him, I recommend that you do, especially El Corrido de Rio Arriba, right? About the court raids in Tijerina and the land rights, and also the corrido Córdoba y Canales. So that was about the social injustices during the civil rights movement in New Mexico. So these ballads give us a little taste of what people were going through at specific time periods and in specific places. And each time the corrido is retold, it becomes its own new story. And so I also have here Linda Ronstadt from right here in Tucson. She also sings corridos, and that brings me to my next point about women and corridos. So the actual genre of the corrido has always been kind of a male-dominated genre, and that's not to say that women aren't included, but a lot of times when they are, it's in a patriarchal framework. So for example, we have one scholar here, Jose Limon, who mentions that women is almost wholly excluded or repressed in the male world of the corrido, in the ballad's predominant imagery, and subject and equally so in its principally male-defined performative context. So like I was saying, it's not that they're not included, but it is oftentimes under a patriarchal framework. And so what this ballad does is it shifts that focus, right? So it's not going to be about men. Well, it does have elements about men, but it's not by men, for men, about men. It's more by women. What I argue is composed by a woman, sung by a woman, and passed on to other women. And it's about women. So lots of women in the mix. And let's go ahead and listen to it. So here we have Quirina Córdoba de Medina. She's holding a picture of her grandmother, Isabel Córdoba, who she learned the ballad from. And this recording is featured in the anthology Nuevo Mexico Hasta Cuando. If you're interested in other corridos as well, I recommend you listen to this anthology and of New Mexico. And so Isabel, the one that's in the picture frame that she's holding, she learned it from her aunt, Alcarita Medina, from the Taos area. So, and that was recorded or transcribed in the 30s during the Federal Works Progress Administration under the New Deal. And so there's this long genealogy, and we can only wonder how many other women were aware of this ballad that it speaks of empowering women. And yet you'll notice some subtleties there that we'll talk about and what it all means. So let's go ahead and listen to the first few coplas, or the first few verses. And while we're listening to it, here's the lyrics. See what you think about the context, right? What year are they mentioning? What is going on? What are the women actually doing? So here we go.
Año de 1844 al entrar, se concede a las mujeres el derecho de votar. El gobierno americano, por tener sabiduría, les concede a las mujeres derecho a ciudadanía. Ya se juntan las mujeres, se ponen a platicar. Comadrita de mi vida, la elección se va a probar. Ya se juntan las mujeres, hacen un club de señoras. Cambian sus candidatas también para gobernadora. Ya se juntan las mujeres, se ponen a platicar, y abandonan sus quehaceres, ellas se van a votar.
Okay, so there's the first few coplas that we have, and right away we can see how language is being transcribed, being that many of us were not given the privilege to learn the Spanish language, you know, as many others who have grown up with Spanish in Latin American countries and whatnot. We have it here written down that we can see and actually say and see the words that she is singing. and see how language is being used. We see different words here like ciudadanía, and these are all linguistic elements that tie into the rich, beautiful Spanish language of New Mexico. But rather than jumping into that, I'd like to start off with the actual date of the corrido, how it's being started. And so it mentions the year 1844. And you know, relating that to the suffrage movement is quite a bit of a stretch, but it does provide some ironic insight into women's rights at the time in New Mexico. So at that time, New Mexico was part of the Republic of Mexico, and it wasn't until a few years later that the US annexed much of what was formerly Mexico. So at the time, women had many more rights as a part of Mexico. And one scholar mentions, in Mexico, a woman lost nothing through marriage. In fact, it freed her from the watchful eye of her dueña or mother and enabled her to enjoy a legal and social independence unknown in other countries. After her marriage, La Tules kept her maiden name, her property, and this is a picture of La Tules, also known as Doña Gertrudis Barceló. So that's talking about her. After her marriage, La Tules kept her maiden name, her property, and her right to make contracts and to institute legal proceedings. This most independent of women also claimed the rather unusual privileges of entertaining whatever friends she pleased. And so we can see that at this time, women were able to own property, to fight in court. Once the territory became part of the US, all of that changed. And I have for an example here, La Tules, who was a prominent business owner at the time. She had her own saloon, she went into court, she defended herself, and very independent woman of the time. And so even though this date may not add up to the actual suffrage movement, it does provide for some insight to women's rights at the time. Let's continue here. Going into this actual suffrage movement of New Mexico, there were some challenges. And the most challenging that the Constitution of New Mexico had was to make any amendments because there were so many provisions. And these provisions included Spanish language, religious rights, and then also the elective franchise. So historian Joan Jensen mentions women in other Western states who achieved state suffrage by 1914 had no such provisions to overcome. So for example, Wyoming, who got suffrage in around 1868 or 1869, the first state to get suffrage, didn't have any of those provisions. But what Nuevo Mexicana women did with this was they not only fought for suffrage by amending, by taking federal action and amending and having this amendment ratified, they also fought for their language rights within this amendment. So they, federal action was the quickest route to suffrage, and it was a means to advocate for their language and culture. So I wanted to point that out. And let's continue here with the actual ballad. So here we have some of the lyrics, right? Ya se juntan las mujeres, they make a women's club. And so by first listening to this, and it'll make the listener wonder, okay, well, were there women's clubs? And indeed there were. And actually this one, Nina Otero Warren, who many of you may have heard of already, was an avid suffragist who led many of those women's clubs. She was appointed by Alice Paul to head the Congressional Union. She was the chair of the Women's Division of the Republican State Committee. She was also the chair of the New Mexico Federation of Women's Clubs. And then in addition, she was an organizer for the National Women's Party. She was the chair of the Board of Public Health. And so it also mentions here that changed their candidates also for women running for governor. So she didn't run for governor, but she was the first Latina in the US to run for the House of Representatives. And she was fundamental to this suffrage movement. She fought for bilingual measures so that people that didn't use English could vote using Spanish, and something that exists to this day that we can be grateful for, that she fought for. And also she was appointed by some of these suffragists to lead these organizations because she had a lot of political ties. She came from a well-educated background, a history of political influences in her family. And so she had a lot of political leverage in her campaign for suffrage. And that's how she also mobilized other women by promoting bilingual rights. And then a lot of these women's clubs fought for not only suffrage, but they offered public aid, welfare, child welfare. And so that was another way to mobilize women and to convert women to the cause. And so here's a little bit more about the women's club movement. Joan Jensen mentioned, not until the emergence of the women's club movement in the late 19th century did an organizational structure exist capable of exerting political pressure in New Mexico. So as I mentioned, there were various women's clubs who were formidable in this movement. There was the Women's Republicans clubs. There was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the strategy was to have these prominent Nuevo Mexicana women to lead these organizations and to make bilingual speeches to convert Nuevo Mexicanas to the cause. And so we can see that here with Aurora Lucero. She also fought for bilingual measures. She's a well-known folklorist of New Mexico, taught at Highlands University. And so she also worked with Otero Warren in these bilingual measures. And then we also have some more lyrics here that mention, reciban sus oficinas secretarias Weste Paz. So they're taking up office, and this would make, you know, any listener think also, so did they really take office? And indeed, yes, women were making strides in political offices, like this one, Soledad Chavez de Chacon. She was the first woman to hold an elected position in New Mexico as the Secretary of State from 1922 to 27. And even though she didn't run for governor, she is also considered the first Latina governor in US, even though it was an acting role, an acting governor for several weeks. But she also had a lot of political ties and something that we should recognize, all of these women, and it makes us also, you know, wonder what other women were out there fighting for this cause. So here we have some of the opposition that the women encountered, right? And two of the main components were, one was from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church mentioned that the National Council of the Catholic Women in the early 1920s mentioned that they denounced attempts to pass a federal equal rights amendment, arguing that working women would lose gender-specific workplace protections. And this idea of gender roles, that we have an avid anti-suffragist here, pictured Senator Thomas Catron. One suffragist mentioned, he thinks all we are good for is to stay home, have children, have more children, cook and wash dishes. So this whole idea of the domestic role of the woman came into play, and they didn't want that, and that's part of this overarching movement, right? And so the actual suffrage movement didn't come without discrimination, right? So we see this on the domestic front, we see this in terms of sex, but there was also discrimination regarding race, regarding culture, regarding education levels, with literacy tests for if you didn't pass, you couldn't vote, and in other states. And so this process was highly complex nationally. Suffragists in the South, an article on the myths of suffrage mentioned that suffragists used racism to appeal to white Southern legislators toward the end of the suffrage battle. And they argued that racism was a way to maintain white, native-born supremacy since white women outnumbered African Americans and immigrants. And then also in New Mexico, you know, Native Americans weren't granted the right to vote until 1948. So this process was highly discriminatory, but at the same time, we can recognize the Nuevo Mexicanas who were able to make some progress and fight for bilingual measures and their culture and their people. So it's something that we definitely should celebrate and recognize. And I have some clips here that I'd like to share with you all. One starting on the left from Las Vegas in 1896, when women were already organizing for this cause. And I'm going to read a little bit on the second paragraph. It says, "The question of women's suffrage is aggressively before all the people of the Great West. The glorious example of Wyoming, where women have voted upon every question that men have for 30 years, has answered every objective of the opponent." So women were already organizing and prior to the turn of the century. And then in the Santa Fe New Mexican from 1907, this little headline mentioned, "Women's suffrage is not making much progress in the US. Evidently, the people are too busy to pay attention to fads." So kind of mocking the movement as a fad. And then we have here Governor Larrazolo, who was the first Mexican governor of New Mexico, a progressive Republican, and he was a proponent for suffrage. And I want to read you something that he mentioned that was also critical in getting the amendment passed. His argument here for the state legislature, and he mentions the provisions of our Constitution seem to me to stand in the way of any legislative enactment on that subject of suffrage. I therefore recommend that you propose an amendment to the state constitution in the manner provided by law to the effect that women may be admitted to the enjoyment of the right of suffrage on an equality with men. Slowly but steadily, the women of our country have been extending their sphere of usefulness. No longer confined exclusively to domestic duties, woman has been enlarging her fields so that today we find her engaged in many of the industrial pursuits of life, working to earn a living very much the same as men do. Therefore, in this particular, they are entitled to the same protection that the law gives to working men." So you can see how he was in support of this amendment and pushing for women's rights. He also was an advocate for bilingual measures, but although, you know, with this overarching goal of having the population learn more English. So that was from 1919, and the amendment was ratified the next year. And let's continue here. Here's one of the headlines from the Santa Fe New Mexican from August of 1920. "Women will vote in the next presidential election in November. Ballots for women achieved at last." So that's when the actual amendment was ratified in August of 1920. And to continue with the balladry, I want to come back to how this oral art form can be shared and transferred and transmitted to the younger generation, and keeping this corrido alive and allowing it to breathe new life. So here we have some local músicos, Lara Manzanares, Tanya Nunez, and Jordan Wax of Lone Piñon, who made their own rendition of El Corrido de la Votación. And we're going to listen to part of it now. And while we're listening to it, keep in mind, what do you notice that's different from the first one that we listened to? And what do you find, yeah, I think that's the main thing. What do you find that's different? And we'll reflect on it in just a minute. So let's go ahead and listen to the second half of it and see what you notice that they've added or included or made their own. Because each and every time a song or a corrido or any story is being told, it is its new story. So here we go. So if you'd like to listen to the rest of it, it's on YouTube and it's featured in one of my articles, and I can tell you about that more later. But this picture is of some girls in the Santa Fe Plaza in 1912 that we found fitting for this. And so going back to the actual ballad, let's take a look here. And what we have is some satire. So now women want to drive trains and manage offices and have the husband stay at home in charge of the kitchen, and have every man governed by his woman. So we have some satire here, some playing around with gender roles. And what I've concluded around this is that it's kind of a sort of a ridiculing the chauvinism launched by male opponents, right, of suffrage, and it's challenging their anxieties of their supporters. So that's what's so much fun about these, right? We can play around with the imagination and actually with reality here too. So going into reality and aspirations, what some of the differences, what were some of those that you noticed? So we have from the first ballad, we noticed, you know, it had a very melancholic tone to it. The melody was very almost like a funeral dirge, right? It's that almost a darkness to it, and yet there's these empowering themes of women uniting and mobilizing. And so it adds for an ironic insight, right? And I believe that's more attributed to that la lucha sigue, right? The battle continues. So although women are making progress, there's still so much more to make. And here with Lon Piñón, we can see how they changed that a bit with the brightness of the mandolin, right? And the instrumentation there, and even this dialogue between man and woman. And that was critical for the suffrage movement. Women had to convince their male counterparts that they were worthy of voting. And then also we see they are adding here presidenta, ingeniera, women of science, and president. And I'd like for us to pause on that for just a moment, because just to think about how our world would be if more women had these presidential roles. How would our world look like? Would there be so much violence still? These are some questions that I just have to throw out there for all of you listening, right? And maybe we can take a look at some of our South American neighbors from Chile and Argentina. And right now, the first Black running vice president for Colombia is campaigning for vice president. So maybe, just something to reflect on. What would our world look like if more women had these roles? And also they added their own twist on the last verse here. So to all the machos que no se animan, get out of the way. If you're not interested, we've got a battle to fight, right? And that battle continues to this day. And I'll talk a bit about that. Right now, I would like to recognize women in New Mexico politics today, right? So New Mexico elected all women of color to the House 2 years ago for the first time in the state's history. And just in December, New Mexico elected an all-women city council in Las Cruces. So some highlights to recognize these women, but also there's still more that needs to be done. And including in that are these barriers to democracy, and that the fight for suffrage continues. There is widespread voter suppression all over today. The ACLU reported 2 years ago that in recent years, more than 400 anti-voter bills have been introduced in 48 states. These bills erect unnecessary barriers for people to vote by mail, or vote in person. And I'm sure that number is much greater if we looked at it today, because even as we speak in Arizona, the legislature has nearly 100 bills, voting bills, with the majority of them being anti-voting bills to suppress the vote from early voting candidates, those who receive early voting ballots in the mail. They are working to purge those votes in Arizona. So SB 1485 erects unnecessary barriers to voting and wrongfully removes Arizonans from the state's early voting list, those that may have medical reasons, those who may live on the reservation. There's lots of components here that they're trying to eradicate from what's called the permanent early voting list, or PEVL. So these barriers continue today as an attack on democracy. And I'd like to mention a little bit more about Nina Otero Warren. So pretty soon, if you still are, using monetary currency, not like plastic or credit cards, if you reach into your pocket, you will soon probably see her face on one of the quarters that you have. So New Mexico native who promoted women's rights is depicted on a newly minted series of quarters, along with other women, historical women in the nation, along with Maya Angelou and others. And this article comes from the Albuquerque Journal. So you may be already aware of that. And I'd like to just mention a little bit about this balladry and the suffrage movement, and Nina Otero Warren's depiction as somewhat of a cultural broker, being that she did come from a well-educated, prominent family background with political ties. I want to speak a little bit about that. And then she also kept her married name, even though she divorced her husband after 2 years. She kept his last name, Warren. So some historians and scholars have pointed her out as a cultural broker, being able to sway both the Nuevo Mexicano and the Anglo opinion at the time. So I'd like to speak to that in one of my articles. And I mentioned contemporary and later historical references of Otero Warren as a cultural broker and exception singled her out from other women, particularly Nuevo Mexicanas of the same period. As scholars peer into communities of women in the past, however, viewing some women as exceptions results in others not being seen at all, because popular forms of organization and the historians who report on them tend to overlook the rank and file membership. Creating social change within a community requires strength in both legislative positions at the top and in mobilization at the grassroots. And this is where La Votación made its mark and continues to make its mark as a vehicle of community organization among women in New Mexico. The oral tradition of the Corrido art form holds the potential to represent several voices throughout the community rather than solely promoting those belonging to the exceptions. So I don't want to discount any of the work that she did. She was formidable in this movement, but I do want to highlight the potential of oral tradition and oral art forms as a way to involve the community and as a potential voice for many of the members of a community. So let me continue here. And this whole idea of the social power of music opens up this window into this other time period. And it also serves as a collective cultural and historical memory and a form of resistance. So there's so many components to the ballad art form that we can recognize and celebrate. And just wanted to point that out. So I also, before anything, I want to really recognize everyone who has made this project possible, from Jenny Vincent in the 60s, the social activist and accordion player. And she made a recording in the 60s of this ballad. Nancy Brown Martinez, who was fundamental with recovering the genealogy and tracing this ballad back to the 30s to the Federal Works Progress Administration. Enrique La Madrid, who inspired me to start with this project years ago. He and David Garcia recorded the version from 2004. And then, of course, our local músicos who have made their own rendition have kept this ballad alive, and we can only hope that they continue to do so with all of our rich cultural traditions and music out there, which they are doing. And so I'm so honored that they took a part of this project and made it their own as well. And so I just have a few questions before leaving and before opening it up to any questions or comments. What is your voting story? What is your community's voting story? What kinds of hidden treasures may you find within your community and your community archives? And if you were to write a corrido about a significant event in your community, what would it be about? So that's everything. I hope this gives you some food for thought, and I'm happy to receive any questions or comments. So thank you. Un gusto estar con ustedes.
Thank you so much, Carmella. If anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to write it in the chat or Q&A. You can also raise your hand to be unmuted. Carmella, we have some applause in the chat. Que viva la opinión. Enrique wrote about Miss Otero Warren. She found out that Mr. Warren had another wife and family in the Philippines.
Oh, that's, I had no idea.
And then also, as a side note, at the library, Jordan Wax and Joanna, his music partner, they do bilingual books and babies at the library with us.
Oh, I'm wonderful.
I had no idea he was going to be part of the presentation. So that's...
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that.
So when was the first time you personally heard Corrido? What sparked the inspiration to go down the path you have in your research?
Right. Great question. So it started while I was doing my master's work at UNM, and I was taking a class on corridos and the romanceros. The corrido can be traced to the romancero in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula. And so I was taking a class with Enrique Lamadrid, folklorist, literary folklorist here in New Mexico, there. I don't know where I'm at, but and he mentioned, hey, take a look. I was looking for a topic to do a final project on, and he said, take a look at this La Votación. And that's how it all started. And then, since then, I've been working on it, and as well with other ballads. So it's been a very rewarding experience so far, learning more about this form of balladry and the historical context around it.
That's awesome. Thank you. Isabella asks, Ms. Pacheco, can you share your email with us? I would like to see if you are interested in giving this presentation to a class of high schoolers.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I could send share my email address. Let's see here. I'll just go ahead and put it in the chat. Oops. Email. Sona, there you go. Thank you very much for your interest, and I'm happy to receive any emails if anyone else has any other questions. Thank you, Liana. I'm glad you were able to make it, and Enrique, gracias. And everyone else who's there. Yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed it. A little bit, to women, especially for Women's History Month now, and I have my sash up here, Women Win the Vote, with the purple and yellow. So, okay, about my article in the New Mexico Historical Review, I actually wanted to share that let me just go ahead and share this. I didn't know if I would have enough time to share everything. I have actually another slide about that. So here's some of the work around this. So the New Mexico Historical Review here has an in-depth analysis of what I just talked about. So if you're really interested in it, I recommend you check this out. The New Mexico Historical Review, it's from the fall of 2020. You can Google them, you can find them, you may have to order it. There's also if you're really interested in suffrage in New Mexico, I really also recommend this PBS special, New Mexico and the Vote, which is, it features other scholars like Kathleen Cahill, Sylvia Ramos Cruz, and others who really get in depth into the suffrage movement. And then I also have some other articles here that I wrote, one about keeping the corrido alive with our local músicos, and then another one from the Smithsonian. So there's a few resources you can that are available. And feel free to take a screenshot if you need, or yeah, so that's everything there. And I'm happy that everyone hopefully enjoyed it.
It was awesome. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much for doing this a million times. Thank you for providing this program for our community. And there's a lot of thank yous, and this is great information in our chat. So I know those attending and those who will view the recording are grateful. Also, I must thank the Friends of the Santa Fe Public Library for sponsoring this event and making it possible. Thank you so much, Carmella. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you for hosting this. I'm so happy I was able to participate and hopefully shed new light on this movement and this rich form of art that we have in New Mexico. And thank you, Brock, for attending and everyone else. So thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Stay in touch. Take care. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Hasta la próxima.